Hello students and welcome to AP European History Unit 2, Reformations and Religious Wars. Time frame is 1500 to 1600 and it correlates to Mackay's chapter 13 of your textbook. The College Board offers us a key concept 1.2 and it states that religious pluralism challenged the concept of a unified Europe. Christianity was already divided before the Reformation began. Most people in Russia and Eastern Europe belonged to one of several national Orthodox churches, sharing theology but divided by language, while most people in Central and Western Europe were Catholics, all saying Mass in Latin. There were also Christian sects in the Middle East, some affiliated with the papacy, others were independent. College Board's key concept 1.2.1 is that the Protestant and Catholic Reformation fundamentally changed theology, religious institutions, culture, and attitudes towards wealth and prosperity. In the Germanic states, peasants launched onto the new Protestant ideas, while in France, England, and Scotland, the urban middle classes were drawn towards Calvinism. The commercial classes found the Calvinist emphasis on labor and hard work especially appealing. This phenomenon led to impassioned debate among historians about the intersection of capitalism and Calvinism. This slide is a painting titled Religious Violence in Urban Life, painted in 1590, and it shows Catholic military forces, including friars in their robes, in a procession through one of the many towns affected by the French religious wars that followed the Reformation, which we'll look at later in this presentation. A quick overview of the Reformation is that Protestantism adopted by the states in Northern Europe. It also rekindled religious enthusiasm. The Catholic Reformation responded to Protestant challenge with some success. It destroyed the religious unity of Western Europe and initiated a period of devastating religious wars in the 16th and 17th century. Two important literary works that come out of the Black Plague were the Canterbury Tales and the Decameron. Both of these used subtle satire to reveal to the literate society the poor performance of the individual clergymen during the crisis years of the plague. This had society turning to individual acts of piety rather than relying on the church. Piety is a virtue that may include religious devotion, spirituality, or a mixture of both. Pietism is a direct relationship between the individual and God that can affect the importance of the hierarchical Church of Rome. During this time, Europeans were exceptionally pious. They made many pilgrimages, remembered the church in their wills, and devoted much of their time to religious causes without depending on the clergy. What did the Catholic Church look like on the eve of the Reformation? Well, for starters, there was only one church in the West, and the Pope was at the top and the ultimate authority. Because the Black Death was so devastating, it brought on a spirit of anti-clericalism that just flourished into a growing disenchantment with the Catholic Church. Anti-clericalism is the opposition to the power or influence of the clergy, especially in politics. They had lost all of their credibility with their poor performance during the Black Death. The next three factors we've already looked at, but let's review them really quick. The Babylonian captivity was when, in the 14th century, the Pope moved his court to Avignon, France. While the papacy resided in France, the popes came under heavy influence of the French kings. Petrarch called this Babylonian captivity in reference to the Jewish exile from Babylon. The split within the Catholic Church that lasted from 1377 to 1417, in which two men, and in 1410 there were three, simultaneously claimed to be the true pope, and each excommunicated one another. Driven by authoritative politics rather than theological disagreement, the schism was ended by the Council of Constance. For a time, these rival claims to the papal throne damaged the reputation of the office. The conciliar movement was a Christian reform movement in the 14th and 15th centuries in the Roman Catholic Church, which held that final authority in spiritual matters resided with the Church as a corporation of Christians, embodied by a general church council, not with the Pope. Growing disenchantment with the Catholic Church and calls for reform came because of their excessive behavior. Criticism of the Church included patronage of the arts, papal tax collection, the papacy as an institution, church wealth, and certain doctrines, for example, the veneration of saints and the centrality of the sacraments. Suggestions for reform centered on improved education and behavior and changes in doctrine. Popular opposition to the clergy was because of clerical abuse in the form of simony, immorality, ignorance, pluralism, absenteeism, and privileges. Simony was the sale of church offices. For example, in 1487, the Pope sold 24 offices. Reformers were outraged that unqualified people would become bishops and cardinals. Clerical immorality included rampant drunkenness, gambling, and promiscuity. Pope Alexander VI, who reigned from 1492 to 1503, had numerous affairs and children out of wedlock. 20% of all priests in the Diocese of Trent kept concubines during the early 16th century. There was clerical ignorance. Priests were barely literate. Clerical pluralism is when the clerics hold more than one church office at a time, and absenteeism was when absent clerics paid poor priests to fulfill the spiritual duties of a local church. They were absent and yet they received payment. There was widespread resentment of clerical privileges and immunities. The clergy were exempt from taxes, yet held large amounts of property. Nepotism, which involves favoring family members in the appointment of church offices, came especially from two popes, Leo X and Clement VIII, who were sons of the Medici rulers of Florence. Pope Paul III made two grandsons cardinals. Let's keep in mind that there were early reformers. The Reformation did not begin with Martin Luther. Another early critic of the church who emphasized a personal relationship with God as being primary was John Wycliffe, the English scholastic philosopher, theologian, biblical translator, reformer, priest, and a seminary professor at the University of Oxford, and a very important predecessor to Protestantism. He stated that the Bible was the sole authority, foreshadowing Martin Luther's views of the early 16th century. He stressed for a personal communion with God. He diminished the importance of sacraments. He attacked the privileged status of the clergy and the luxury and pomp with which these parishes and their ceremonies enjoyed. He advocated for the translation of the Bible into the vernacular, and his followers were known as Lollards. He died of a stroke, but after his death, he was still declared a heretic. His remains were burned along with all of his writings. One such early reformer was Jan Hus, the Czech theologian and philosopher that lived between 1369 and 1415. He was a key predecessor to Protestantism. He was a religious leader who lived in Bohemia and led a national movement there for a church separate from Roman authority. His followers were known as Hussites, and they actively staged large rebellions during the 14th century. Jan Hus was declared a heretic and burned at the stake. It ignited the Hussite wars in Bohemia. After his death, the people of Bohemia moved even more rapidly away from papal teachings, provoking Rome to pronounce a crusade against them in 1420. A papal bull authorized the execution of all supporters of Hus and of Wycliffe. Mentioned earlier in this presentation, and something that you should know the definition of, is that of a papal bull, which is a public decree, letters, patent, or a charter issued by a pope of the Catholic Church. Brethren of the Common Life, Thomas A. Kempis and Erasmus. The Brethren of the Common Life was a Roman Catholic pietist religious community founded in the Netherlands in the 14th century by Gerard Groot. Formerly a successful and worldly educator, he had a religious experience. From then on, he preached a life of simple devotion to Jesus Christ. Without taking up vows, the brethren banded together in communities, gave up their worldly goods to live chaste, and strictly regulated their lives in common houses. They devoted every waking hour to attending divine service, reading and preaching sermons, laboring productively, and taking meals in common that were accompanied by the reading aloud of scriptures. Two members were Thomas Kempis and Erasmus. Thomas Kempis wrote The Imitation of Christ, where he encouraged Christians to live a simply and make religion a personal experience. Erasmus, we know, wrote In Praise of Folly, where he criticized the corruption of the church and the hypocrisy of the clergy. A contemporary remarked that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther had hatched. College Board's Key Concept 1.2.1.A. Christian humanism, embodied in the writings of Erasmus, employed Renaissance learning in the service of religious reform. One cannot deny the impact that the Northern Renaissance and Christian humanism had on the Protestant Reformation. Christian humanisms of the Northern Renaissance criticized the Church and questioned the validity of the Latin Vulgate, or the Catholic Bible. Textual criticisms and new translations of the Bible undermined Catholic authority. In the South, the Italian Renaissance was at times marked by a de-emphasis on religion, while it emphasized on secularism and individualism among high church leaders. This drew significant criticism of those who opposed the moral decline of the church. The early Reformation and Martin Luther. Martin Luther was born in Saxony. He studied law and entered the Augustinian order. He was ordained priest in 1507. He earned a doctorate in theology and became a professor of scriptures at the new university in Wittenberg. His theology included justification by faith. This was the core of Luther's doctrine and the belief that salvation and justification came through faith alone and not through human effort. God's word, as revealed in the scripture and not through church traditions, would lead to salvation. Indulgences were a document issued by the Catholic Church that reduced the time in purgatory and believed to forgiveness of all sins. Pope Leo X used the sale of indulgences to raise money to finance his building of plans in Rome. John Tetzel was authorized by Pope Leo X to sell indulgences in order to raise funds for the building of the new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Tetzel's selling of indulgences had become egregious, and to make matters worse, Tetzel was selling them in Luther's backyard. This caused Luther to come up with his 95 Theses. He was outraged by the sale of these indulgences and believed that they undermined the seriousness of the sacrament of penance, competed with the preaching of the gospel, and downplayed the importance of charity in Christian life. He wrote his 95 Theses on the power of indulgences, and he had it printed in Latin and German. And of course, the popular opposition included the sale of indulgences, which was when people were paying money to the church to absolve their sins or sins of their loved ones in order to get out of purgatory quicker. The printing press facilitated the spread of Luther's 95 Theses with astonishing speed. Soon everyone knew Luther's crusade. In part because of pressure from his adversaries, Luther moved further and further away from Catholic theology. Popes and councils could err, he concluded, and there was little distinction between clergy and lay people. He also believed that secular leaders should reform the church if the Pope could not, and believed that clerical celibacy was fruitless. Initially, the Pope viewed the issue of Luther's 95 Theses as an insignificant disagreement between Augustinian and Dominican monks because theological debates among the clergy members was not unprecedented. But by 1518, Luther continued to defy calls from the Pope to stop his crusade. He was protected by Elector Frederick III of Saxony. By this point, Luther did not seek to create a new church, but rather to reform the Catholic Church. Luther took part in debates with John Eck, one of the great Catholic theologians, at Leipzig in 1519. Luther denied both the infallibility of the Pope and the infallibility of a general council. Luther claimed that the Church had erred when it executed John Huss for heresy. This was the point of no return for Luther. In 1520, Luther published his theology of reform in 3 separate works. The cornerstone of his theology is that salvation can be achieved through faith alone. He rejected that good works as a means to salvation, but believed that good works followed faith. The Bible was the sole authority, the primacy of the Scripture. Only 2 sacraments, baptism and communion, were valid. He rejected transubstantiation, when the wine and the bread in the Eucharist transform into the actual body and blood of Christ, which is the belief of Catholics. He instead advocated for consubstantiation, the real presence of God in the bread and wine. The church consisted of a priesthood of believers and not a hierarchical structure as with the Catholic Church. Christians were not subject to the Pope's interpretation of the Bible because the Bible contained all that was needed for a person to lead a Christian life. A church hierarchy of bishops and priests, therefore, was unnecessary. He again criticized the sale of indulgences and simony. He encouraged German princes to reform the church within their states. He rejected the Catholic monastic tenets of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Luther was thus excommunicated by Pope Leo X in 1520. A papal bull issued by Pope Leo X ended up being thrown into a fire by Martin Luther. The Diet of Worms of 1521 was an imperial council that was convened to decide the fate of Martin Luther. A tribunal of the Holy Roman Empire with power to outlaw and sentence execution through stake burning, Charles V had promised before his election as Holy Roman Emperor that he would not allow anyone in his empire to be excommunicated unless there was a fair trial. In the trial, Charles demanded that Luther recant his writings. Luther refused. He stated, "Here I stand. I can do no other." The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V presided over the entire Diet. The Diet declared the Edict of Worms, which made Martin Luther an outlaw and forbade anyone from helping him escape punishment. However, Luther had a protector in Frederick III, and he was taken to his castle where he was protected and continued his writing. In 1523, Luther translated the Bible into the vernacular, profoundly influencing the development of the modern German language. It served to democratize religion, as any literate German now had access to the scripture, and it was a distinct print culture developed in Germany and spread to other countries. The Confessions of Augsburg of 1530 was an attempt to compromise the statement of religious faith in order to unite the Lutheran and the Catholic princes of the Holy Roman Empire. It was written by Luther's friend Philip. Though it was rejected by Catholic princes, it soon became the traditional statement of the Lutheran Church that salvation is obtained through faith alone, the Bible is the sole authority, and the Lutheran Church is comprised of a priesthood of all believers. College Board Key Concept 1.2.3. Conflicts among religious groups overlapped with political and economic competition within and among states. Emperor Charles V sought to stop Protestantism and preserve the dominance of Catholicism. In a sense, Charles was similar to a medieval emperor in that he was trying to maintain religious unity in Europe. He was now allied with the Pope in trying to stamp out heresy. Charles was also preoccupied with the Turkish threat in Hungary and his dynastic struggle with Francis I of France. Between 1521 and 1530, Charles was away from the Holy Roman Empire. Much of his time he was spending in Italy, and thus Charles could not focus his military solely on Germany at the time that Protestantism was spreading vigorously. Key Concept 1.4.2.d. The attempts of landlords to increase their revenues by restricting or abolishing the traditional rights of peasants led to revolt. Responses to Luther and Calvin included religious radicals such as the Anabaptists and other groups such as the German peasants. Key Concept 1.4.2.d. The attempts of landlords to increase their revenues by restricting or abolishing the traditional rights of peasants led to revolt. Following crop failures between 1523 and 1524, the seizure of village common lands by the nobility, and the imposition of additional rents and taxes led German peasants to rebel, basing their demands on the scriptures. Luther initially sided with them, but later turned against them as the German Peasants' War unfolded in 1525. He argued that the independence from the Roman Church did not mean opposition to legally established secular powers. Nearly 75,000 peasants were killed, and the authority of lay rulers was strengthened considerably. After 1525, the Reformation lost most of its popular appeal. The 12 Articles of 1525 are considered the first draft of human rights and civil liberties in continental Europe after the Roman Empire. German peasants demanded an end to serfdom and tithes and other practices of feudalism that oppressed the peasantry, for example, hunting rights. In Germany and Switzerland, the ruler determined the official form of religious practice in his or her jurisdiction. The presence of minority faiths represented a political threat to the security of the state, and few believed in religious liberty. Luther appealed to national sentiment through the language and tradition of the German people. Some German rulers were attracted to Luther's ideas, while others embraced the new religion due to material considerations. Embracing Protestantism meant these rulers could enlarge their territorial holdings, increase their wealth by confiscating church property, and gain independence from the emperor. Charles V was a staunch Catholic, and the spread of Protestantism caused the outbreak of religious wars in the 1520s. Fighting began in Switzerland, made up of autonomous territories called cantons. A treaty allowed each canton to determine its own religion and to give up its foreign alliances. Zwingli was killed in one of these such battles in 1531. Charles called an imperial diet in Augsburg in 1530 to stem religious division and ordered all Protestants to return to the fold. They refused and formed a military alliance. Charles could not respond militarily since he was fighting wars with the Ottoman Turks and the French. Officially recognizing Lutheranism, the Peace of Augsburg was developed. Each political authority was to decide whether the territory would be Lutheran or Catholic, and was to leave other territories in peace. Northern and central Germany became Lutheran, and the south remained Catholic. The population had to follow the religion of its rulers. Dissidents had to convert or leave. The Peace of Augsburg put an end to religious wars in Germany for many years, but Charles was never able to unite his empire under a single church. He abdicated his throne in 1556. To review, the Peace of Augsburg had at the table Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Schmalkaldic League. The treaty between Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Schmalkaldic League was signed in September of 1555 at the imperial city of Augsburg. It officially ended the religious struggle between the two groups and made the legal division of Christianity permanent within the Holy Roman Empire, allowing its rulers to choose Lutheranism or Roman Catholicism as the official confession of their state. However, the Peace of Augsburg arrangement is also credited to ending much Christian unity around Europe. Before, the main religion was Roman Catholicism, with few practitioners in Lutheranism. Now, if a ruler chose for his or her subjects to practice Lutheranism, the population which endorsed and practiced Lutheranism increased greatly. Calvinism was not allowed until the Peace of Westphalia, which we will talk in the following presentation. In northern Germany, the League of Schmalkalden, formed by newly Protestant Lutheran princes to defend themselves against Charles V's drive to re-Catholicize Germany. Francis I of France allied with the League, despite being Catholic, between 1535 and 1544. France's interest was to keep Germany divided. The conflict played an important role in the long-term political fragmentation of Germany. Catholic unity in Germany never again occurred. Though Charles was finally victorious over the League in 1547, Lutheranism had spread and taken hold of much of Central Europe. Charles, by the 1550s, was forced up to give restoring Catholicism in all German states of the empire. Radical reformers included groups of Protestants from Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands that wanted to create a community of believers separate from the states. Some believed in religious toleration, communal ownership of property, and a life of simplicity, while others rejected those who deviated. Anabaptists, for example, adopted the baptism of adult believers and not that of the infant. Initially, these reformers triggered persecution both from Protestant and Catholic authorities. Some groups, like Quakers and the Baptists and the Congregationalists, had an impact on the growth of American religious and democratic ideals. The founding fathers' opposition to the establishment of state churches was influenced by 16th century religious radicals. The Anabaptist was a member of a fringe or radical movement of the Protestant Reformation and spiritual ancestors of modern Baptists, Mennonites, and Quakers. The movement's most distinctive tenet was adult baptism. In its first generation, converts submitted to a second baptism, which was a crime punishable by death under the legal codes of the time. Members rejected the label Anabaptist or rebaptizer, for they repudiated their own baptism as infants as a blasphemous formality. They considered the public confession of sin and faith, sealed by adult baptism, to be the only proper baptism. Following the Swiss reformer Zwingli, they held that infants are not punishable for sin until they become aware of good and evil and can exercise their own free will, repent, and accept baptism. They formed in Zurich in 1525 and became known as an association of believers. They had no connection to any state. They rejected secular agreements, refused to take civil oaths, pay taxes, hold public office, or serve in the military. Baptists opposed childhood baptism as only adults, they believe, could make the decision to commit to Christ. Baptists also rejected the idea of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. As millenarians, they believed the end of the world was near. In 1532, a radical group of revolutionary Anabaptists took control of the northwestern German city of Munster. The leader of the radical group was John Leyden, who lived from 1509 to 1536. Polygamy was instituted as John had 16 wives. Women also served as leaders of the movement. All books, except for the Bible, were burned in the city. The Anabaptists began killing some Lutherans and Catholics. Known as the Tragedy of Munster of 1534, combined armies of Protestant and Catholic forces captured the city and executed the Anabaptist leaders. Bodies of John Leyden and others were tortured and executed in the marketplace. Their dead bodies exhibited in cages which hung from the steeple of the St. Lambert's Church. Some of the long-term impacts left by the Anabaptists were the Mennonites that were founded by Dutch leader Menno Simons. They emphasized pacifism, perhaps in reaction to what happened at Munster. Also, the Quakers in England shared similar beliefs. Thousands came to America, where they founded and controlled Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Along with Martin Luther, there was Ulrich Zwingli. Zwingli was a Swiss humanist, priest, and reformer who was convinced that Christian life rested on the scriptures, which were the pure words of God and the sole basis of religious truth. He also attacked indulgences, the Mass, clerical celibacy, and monasticism. Based on the protest of reforming German princes against the Catholic majority, Protestant became the name for followers of Zwingli and Luther who wanted to break away from the Roman Catholic Church. The term came to describe all non-Catholic Western Christian groups. Salvation comes through faith alone, not through the sacraments or good works. Religious authority resides solely in the Bible, and the Church is the spiritual priesthood of all believers as opposed to the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church with the Pope at its top. Disputes within Protestantism were mainly over the Eucharist. Luther believed in the real presence of Christ in the sacrament as a result of God's mystery, but Zwingli saw it merely as symbolic memorial in which Christ was present in the Spirit amongst believers. The Colloquy of Marburg in 1529 was convened to settle the issue but failed to resolve these differences. Calvin established a theocracy in Geneva by 1540. Geneva became the new center of the Reformation in Europe. Geneva became home to Protestant exiles from England, Scotland, and France, who later returned to their countries with Calvinist ideas. The Church of Calvin served as the model for the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, the Huguenot Church in France, and the Puritan churches in England and New England. Like Zwingli in Zurich, Calvin believed church and city should combine to enforce Christian behavior. Only those who committed to following Calvinism were allowed to live in the city. Calvinism became the most dynamic force in international Protestantism, spreading throughout the continent of Europe. John Calvin established Calvinism, which became the most significant of the new Protestant sects. A sect is a group of people with somewhat different religious beliefs from those of a larger group to which they belong. Synonyms for the word sect include cult or denomination. As a young man, John Calvin studied law, which had a decisive impact on his mind and later his thought. In 1533, he experienced a religious crisis and, as a result, converted to Protestantism. Calvin believed that God had specifically selected him to reform the church. Calvin did not believe humans had free will and ascribed to the theological principle called predestination. When men and women cannot actively work to achieve salvation, rather, God, in his infinite wisdom, decided at the beginning of time who would be saved and who would be damned. Instead of leading to pessimism, many Calvinists believed that although one's fate could not be changed, hard work, thrift, and proper moral conduct could serve as signs that one was among the elect. Calvinism was the most militant and uncompromising of all Protestant sects. For example, they had consistories, which are judiciaries made up of lay elders or presbyters that had the power to impose harsh penalties for those who did not follow God's law. Activities such as drinking, singing, secular music, dancing, and usury, which is lending money at more than 5%, was severely sanctioned. Your textbook states that between 1542 and 1546, so in 4 years alone, 76 persons were banished from Geneva and 58 were executed for heresy, adultery, blasphemy, and witchcraft. Among them was the Spanish humanist and refugee Michael Servetus, who was burned at the stake for denying the scriptural basis of the Trinity, rejecting child baptism, and insisting that a person under 20 cannot commit a mortal sin, all of which were viewed as threats to society. Calvin's foundational work for Calvinism is in his book Institutes of the Christian Religion that he wrote from 1536 up until 1559 when he decided that it was complete. In it, he writes that good works are a sign that you have been chosen by God, which is the concept of predestination. He was only 27 when he started writing the book. And yes, you too can buy a copy on Amazon for $36.35. The College Board's key concept 1.2.1.c is that some Protestant groups sanctioned the notion that wealth accumulation was a sign of God's favor and a reward for hard work. A sanction is to give official permission or approval for an action. Protestant work ethic, Calvinists later emphasized the importance of hard work and accompanying financial success as a sign that God was pleased. John Knox dominated the reform movement in Scotland and was determined to establish a state church there and structure it after the model of Geneva, where he had studied and worked with Calvin. Knox persuaded the Scottish Parliament to end papal authority and rule by bishops and instead establish governance by presbyters or councils of ministers. The Presbyterian Church of Scotland was strictly Calvinist in doctrine, adopted a simple and dignified service, and emphasized preaching. Huguenots were French Calvinists who were brutally suppressed in France. They were especially strong among the nobility, although Calvinism saw converts from every social class. We'll talk more about the Huguenots and the violence when we discuss the religious wars. The first area outside the Holy Roman Empire to officially accept the Reformation was the Kingdom of Denmark-Norway under King Christian III, who reigned between 1536 and 1559. Danish scholars studied at the University of Wittenberg, and Lutheran ideas spread into Denmark very quickly. In the 1530s, the king officially broke with the Catholic Church, and most clergy followed. In northern Norway and Iceland, which Christian also ruled, reactions were more violent, and Lutheranism was gradually imposed on a largely unwilling populace. In Sweden, Gustavus Vasa, who reigned between 1523 to 1560, came to the throne during a civil war with Denmark. Gustavus then took control of the church personnel and income, and Protestant ideas spread, though the Swedish church did not officially accept Lutheran theology until later in that century. The Dutch Reformed Church developed in the United Provinces of the Netherlands. The rise of Calvinism in the Netherlands as a dominant religion set the stage for a revolt against the Inquisition of King Philip II of Spain. The Netherlands declared its independence in 1581, although it would not be officially recognized by all European powers until 1648. Puritans in England were highly pressured by Queen Elizabeth I for more reforms, but were largely kept at bay. They later established colonies in America in a region that became known as New England, for example, Massachusetts and Connecticut. They were victorious in the English Civil War, 1642 to 1649. Calvinism did not spread to Ireland, Spain, and Italy as they remained heavily Catholic. Unitarians were another group that assert the unity of God and reject the doctrine of Trinity. A member of the church or religious body maintaining Unitarian beliefs and typically rejecting formal dogma in favor of a rationalist approach to belief. Luther did not believe in the legitimacy of any other faith except mainstream Protestantism. College Board's key concept 1.2.1.a is that monarchs and princes such as the English rulers Henry VIII and Elizabeth I initiated religious reform from the top down in an effort to exercise greater control over religious life and morality. John Wycliffe's followers, the Lollards, still existed in certain regions of England by the 16th century. William Tyndale, a humanist, translated the Bible into English in 1526. This Bible became the basis for the King James Version from the early 1600s. Tyndale was hunted down and executed in 1536 after thousands of English Bibles had made their way to England. Only Latin or Greek translations were allowed. Tyndale also refused to recognize Henry VIII's leadership of the Anglican Church. Henry VIII reigned from 1509 to 1547 and was the second of the Tudor monarchs. If we remember our section on new monarchies, the War of the Roses in England planted the Tudor house on the throne of England. And this is Henry's father, Henry VII. Henry VIII was a conservative Catholic who supported the Church and the Pope and opposed Protestant reforms. The defense of seven sacraments, he vehemently criticizes Luther's view. The Pope awarded Henry with the title of Defender of the Faith. Since the 14th century, the English Catholic Church had already a significant degree of autonomy. Kings had the power to appoint bishops, something that France did not gain until 1516 with the Concordat of Bologna. The establishment of the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, all starts when Henry is seeking an annulment from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, because she could not bear him a son. They had only one daughter, Mary, that had survived out of 5 childbirths. Having a son was necessary to preserve the strength of the Tudor dynasty. Mary was betrothed to the Dauphin of France. If she inherited the throne from Henry, England would become subject to French control. Henry believed that God was punishing him for having married his brother's widow. A passage he referenced in the book of Leviticus in the Bible was the basis of his argument. He had received earlier a papal dispensation from Pope Clement VII, allowing him to marry Catherine, and now he sought the annulment. Pope Clement, under pressure from Charles V, who was nephew of Catherine of Aragon, was vigorously opposed to the annulment. He took no action on Henry's appeal. When Anne Boleyn failed twice to produce a male heir, Henry VIII charged her with adulterous incest and had her beheaded in 1536. His third wife, Jane Seymour, finally gave Henry the desired son, Edward, but she died in childbirth. Though England's break from Rome arose out of King Henry VIII's desire for a new wife, he had other motives that included political, social, and economic elements. Henry used Parliament to remove the English Church from papal jurisdiction and to make himself the supreme head of the Church in England. Although the English Church retained such traditional Catholic practices and doctrines as confession, clerical celibacy, and transubstantiation, Henry dissolved the English monasteries because he wanted their wealth. The confiscation and sale of monastic lands enriched the royal treasury and strengthened the upper classes, tying them to both Tudor dynasty and the new Protestant church. New bureaucratic machinery was needed to manage the formerly monastic lands, so Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, reformed and centralized the king's household, the council, the secretariat, and the exchequer, and set up new departments. Surplus funds went into a fund to be applied to deficits, resulting in greater efficiency and economy, as well as the growth of a centralized bureaucratic state. Most clergy and officials accepted Henry's moves, but in 1536, popular opposition in the north led to the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive rebellion that proved the largest in English history. The Pilgrims eventually accepted the truce, but their leaders were arrested, tried, and executed. People rarely converted to Protestantism overnight. Most reacted to an action of the crown in their neighborhood, with a combination of resistance, acceptance, and collaboration. Loyalty to the Catholic Church was particularly strong in Ireland. Most Irish people remained Roman Catholic, even after the Irish Parliament severed ties with Rome and established the Church of Ireland on the English pattern, thus adding religious antagonism to the ethnic hostility that had been a feature of England's policy towards Ireland for centuries. The English harshly repressed Irish armed opposition to the Reformation, confiscating and selling Catholic property and shipping the profits to England. The Statute of the Six Articles of 1539 maintains that the Anglican Church would maintain most of the Catholic doctrines despite its independence from Rome. Some of these are that they maintain the seven sacraments, celibacy for the clergy, and transubstantiation. The Anglican Church in the United States is known as the Episcopalian Church. After the death of Henry VIII, Edward II Mary Tudor, the devoutly Catholic daughter of Catherine of Aragon, rescinded the Reformation legislation of her father's reign, restored Roman Catholicism, and executed several hundred Protestants. She was married to Philip II, the future heir to the Spanish throne. 300 people were executed, including bishops and Archbishop Kramer. Her opponents called her Bloody Mary. Next in line was Elizabeth I, who reigned from 1558 to 1603. She was known as the Virgin Queen. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Catholics saw her as an illegitimate child and thus rejected her legitimacy regarding the throne. She held strong Protestant views. She effectively oversaw the development of Protestantism in England. She was a politique. She was a practical politician who carefully navigated a middle ground between Anglicanism and Protestantism. Puritans, or English Calvinists, sought to reform the church. Elizabeth shrewdly chose a course between the extremes. Working through Parliament, she gave to have officials swear that she was the supreme religious and political matters. She required her subjects to attend services in the Church of England, but did not interfere with their privately held beliefs. Known as the Elizabethan settlement, Elizabeth in Parliament required conformity to the Church of England, but people were in effect allowed to worship whatever they wanted. The Anglican Church largely resembled Lutheranism. Some church practices, including ritual, resembled Catholic practices. The Book of Common Prayer was instituted in 1559. Catholicism remained, especially among the gentry, but could not be practiced openly. Services were given in English. Monasteries were not reestablished. The clergy was allowed to marry. Everyone was required to attend church services of the Anglican Church. And if they were absent, they were fined. In 1563, the 39 Articles defined the creed of the Anglican Church. It followed Protestant doctrine, but was vague enough to accommodate most of the English, except for the Puritans. Some Catholics unsuccessfully plotted assassination attempts and invasions against Elizabeth. One of them was Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's Catholic cousin and next in line to the English throne. She became implicated in a plot to assassinate Elizabeth, a conspiracy that had the full backing of Spain's Philip II. When the English executed Mary, the Catholic Pope urged Philip to retaliate, which he attempted to do so by sending a vast fleet across the English Channel to attack England. On May 9, 1588, The Spanish Armada met an English fleet of ships that were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable and carried greater firing power. A combination of storms and squalls, spoiled food and rank, water, inadequate Spanish ammunition, and English fire ships gave England the victory and enhanced English national sentiment. The defeat of the Spanish Armada prevented Philip II from reimposing Catholicism on England by force, but the war between England and Spain dragged on for years. Elizabeth's long and successful reign placed her among the greatest European ruler in European history. Ethnic factors often determine the course of the Reformation in Eastern Europe. Most Czechs in Bohemia in the 15th century had adopted the ideas of Jan Hus, and the German emperor had been forced to recognize a separate Hussite church. Lutheranism appealed to Germans in Bohemia in the 1520s and the 30s, and the nobility embraced Lutheranism in opposition to Catholic Habsburgs. Luther's ideas took root in Germanized towns in Poland and Lithuania, but were opposed by King Sigismund I, as well as by ordinary Poles who held strong anti-German feelings. The Reformation tradition of John Calvin, which stressed the power of the church elders, appealed to the Polish nobility. Doctrinal differences among Calvinists and Lutherans and other groups prevented united opposition to Catholicism, and by 1650, due to the efforts of the Jesuits, Poland was again staunchly Roman Catholic. Hungary's experience with the Reformation was even more complex. Lutheranism was spread by Hungarian students who had studied in Wittenberg, and sympathy for it developed at the court of King Louis II. However, its status as the German heresy was an issue until the Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman, crushed the Hungarians in 1526 and divided the Hungarian kingdom into 3 parts. In the face of Turkish indifference to the religious conflicts of Christians, whom they regarded as infidels and required to pay extra tax to the Sultan, many Magyar Hungarians nobles accepted Lutheranism. Lutheran schools and parishes multiplied and peasants welcomed the new faith. The majority of people in Hungary were Protestant until the late 17th century, when Hungarian nobles recognized Habsburg Catholic rule and Ottoman Turkish withdrawal in 1699 led to Catholic restoration.